I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. First, I'll tell you a little bit about these. Well, I'm not going to tell you about the letters. I'll tell you about the people involved. First, we're going to start with Rose Landers. She was a Landers from Katomet. She was schooled in Bourne. She graduated from high school in 1899, right here in the good old town of Bourne. She went on to the Bridgewater Normal School in Bridgewater, which is now Bridgewater Teachers College or State College, and she graduated and did very well. Her life, when she was in Bridgewater, she met a man, and you know, she fell in love like a lot of young people do, and she became engaged to this man. And just as she graduated from college and this man was graduating, he would come down to visit her. She lived in Katomet. He lived in Middleborough. And the chosen way transportation at the time, you know, you really couldn't hitchhike. People used to hop on the trains. That's all. I mean, they didn't buy a ticket. They'd literally hop on the side of the train and climb on the train and, you know, ride to Katomet. Well, her betrothed, so to speak, the man she was engaged to, she'd gone to school with, her own true love, one night jumped on the train in Middleborough, Winter's Eve, and slipped, and he went under the train. And then that was the end of that, and he died, and she was devastated, heartbroken completely. And along about the same time, her own father died. And she lived down in Katomet, and her father built bogs, and he owned bogs, and that was how he made his living. And there was her and her two sisters and her mother. Her mother was a very strong, strong woman. Nobody knew how strong she was yet, but she was. And she kept the bogs going, and she kept the business going. And she was really kind of beside herself that her daughter Rose just, you know, she graduated from college. She just was just despondent all the time. And so she arranged for her to meet this young captain. Guy was 4 years younger than her at the time. This Captain Alden Barlow. He lived in Pocasset, which wasn't too far away. And she convinced Rose that, you know, marry this guy. You're never going to get over your own true love. So marry this man, and, you know, life will be good. He'll be wealthy. He'll be this. He'll be that. And he was doing pretty good. You know, he was really doing well. He was 4 years younger than her, but he was a master of the fore and aft rig, which was just kind of phasing out. But he also was a master of steam. He could run any steamship. He could run any size steamship. He was a master. So marry this guy. And she did. She kind of got into this arranged marriage, and she married Alden Barlow. And her mother convinced her, you know, that this guy is, he's a seagoing man. He will never be home. He'll never bother you. Just go for it, you know? This is good for you. And if you have children, it'll be good for them. And sure enough, she married Alden. You know, and it really was kind of a loveless marriage. And shortly, you know, it wasn't long, and they had a son. It was like 1911, and then they had a daughter. But Rose always kept the engagement ring from her own true love. She always kept that. And every time Alden was around, because, you know, it's his wife, it's home, he would try to steal the ring. You know, because that ring really bothered him. That ring, you know, he wanted that ring gone. So one time, well, Alden's out at sea. She was very talented. She could knit and she could crochet and she could mend stuff. She made this little doll. Really cute, like a little elf. And inside this little doll, she put that ring. And she sewed it all up. You know, and she left it in the living room. It'd be on the couch, or it'd be on the stand next to the couch, or it was kind of like Waldo, you know, that we have nowadays. This little elf that she made with a diamond ring in it. And the captain would come home, and he was so happy that she didn't have the ring anymore. And he'd sit and read, because you have to renew his license every couple of years. You have to do a lot of studying. And he was always playing with the doll. Had no idea. He loved the doll. It was really nice. And she always had the doll right there. And she got a kind of a big kick out of it too, you know. And it really was a loveless marriage. He was a captain. He was a bully. It's really what he was. I mean, I knew this guy. He was my grandfather. You know, I had to call him Captain Barlow. You know, I was 5 years old. You know, I mean, that's how rigid he was. And he was very rigid with her. As time went on, you know, they'd been living part-time in New York City because that's where he sailed out of, as did his brother. He bought a bunch of land here on the Cape, and he built her a house. And what I mean by a bunch of land is, if you were in, and I'll pass this around, this is a picture of his father's house. And this is a picture of his grandfather's house. So this would have been Edward Barlow. This would have been Jesse Barlow. Well, where all these houses are, all the way down to here, all this land, he bought all that land. And the first thing he did was he put a big well in. Started selling off house lots. And if you bought a house lot from him, this was his side business besides being a captain. You had to buy your water from him forever. Or at least until he died. Well, he developed a lot of this land. And even when he passed away in the 1960s, a lot of this land wasn't developed yet. It had all been done through the planning boards. It had been all done. And my father had to finish selling the land off. But by then, the town water was out there, so you could buy it without being subject to his water rules. But he was a pretty smart guy. But he bought all that land for a song back in the early 1900s because it was all considered to be swampland basically back then. And the highland is where all his parents and grandparents had lived. So I'll pass that around and you get a little look at it. To get a little, you know, there were hundreds of house lots, you know, that he'd spent his whole life just selling off. But that house in particular, next to the well, I'm going to say
What
it's...
are we looking at? Is this,
Okay.
is that national?
Yep. Nope. This is all Pecasset. That's all Winnowmet Bluffs.
Oh, okay.
That's the road out to Wings Neck before anything was there.
Okay.
So all this land on that side of the road he bought all the way out to Richmond.
So Wings Neck's over here.
Right. So,
Cool.
and that's the water well.
Oh, I see.
Eventually he moved that up closer to Chickadee Lane. But only because he was developing further down and he had problems with his water. In other words, a lot of the pipes, he was pretty cheap. You know, he'd only bury the water lines down 2 feet and they would always freeze in the wintertime. So in the spring, but they were all summer homes, so he didn't care. Okay, so that's a little bit about Alden. He's very successful. And like I said, he bought all that land and he had a lot of money and he lost it in the stock market crash. So that was it, gone. You know, but as leading up to that, I mean, he was a young captain. He joined the Navy during World War I. He went right in, and they gave him a minesweeper and sent him to Europe. This is in World War I. And they sent him to Europe. It's like sending a kid into a candy store. You know, he was a captain. He had a lot of authority. He had his own ship. People respected him. And he met all these women at all these different events that they had over there. And he really liked cigars, he liked scotch, and he liked women. You know, and to the day he died. And probably in that order. But, you know, that was his life. And here he has at home a wife and a couple of young children and a homestead, yet, you know, he's like a whole different guy when he leaves the country. And he was, and he was just involved with all these different women, but there was nobody here knew anything about that. You know, he was all over there, literally. And at the end of the war, during World War I, I'm not going to say a large percentage of the freighters and the shipping ships, the old fore and aft rigs, and they were all destroyed in the war. So it was a big shortage of ships, big shortage. And, you know, he really made a lot of money because he had a ship and he hauled freight, and he made a lot of money. So he was making money like crazy. But he worked on it like out of an agency in New York City. Because there was such a great shortage of ships, people were rebuilding anything just to carry freight to make money. And the company he was working for, somebody from the British West Indies came into the office one day with a photograph of a ship. And it was this ship. And I'll pass this around right here. It was a fore and aft rig that had a motor, could carry about 400 people. And I'll just send this around. This is a picture of it right here. And it's a square-rigged schooner that has a, you know, it wasn't a schooner. It was a big sloop schooner, three-masted schooner. It was a big boat, probably 190 feet long, big boat. Came in with a picture of it and explained that this boat was anchored off of Cape Three Points in southwest Africa. Explained to his company. And they said, you know, it's been anchored there for 2 years. There had been a big movement of people who were of African American descent after World War I who decided they wanted to go back to Africa. So this ship with 400 basically natives of Africa were going back to an area near this 3 Points. And I wish I could tell you the exact name of the place, but I can't anymore. It's Salt Pond listed here. And it's a part of Africa, and it's on the southwest, on the Gold Coast, more or less. So they had bought this ship, sailed it back to Africa, you know, and it was a motorized ship, but it had sails. They sailed it back to Africa with the intent of sending it back to the United States to get more people. And you know, they were going to build this large colony or village of people. Well, they all got to Africa, right on the equator. Now, who's going to come back? Nobody. Nobody was interested in coming back. Here they were, you know, there was no more Europeans to deal with. They just, their own people. Everything was great. And the guy that had organized the whole thing, they called him Sam, they called him King Sam, and they made him their leader. So the company said, oh, yeah, so we can just they bought the boat from the mortgage company. Now they're just going to send somebody over to tow it back. Because they need boats. And this boat, as far as they knew, was seaworthy. So first they sent an ocean-going tug. And it happened to be named the Charles Morgan. And a crew, they loaded it up with rope and they loaded it up with coal. And they sent it to tow this boat back. And the Charles Morgan was never heard from again. Left New York, never heard from again. They never know what happened to that tugboat or its crew or anything. It was just, they figured it went down somewhere in the North Atlantic and it was gone. So my grandfather had a small freighter coming back from Europe, came into New York. So they told him the story, you know, and they said to him, would you go get this boat? And he said, yeah, give me some coal, I'm ready. He didn't want to go home. He just wanted to go. He's going back to Europe, he don't care. You know, and sure enough, they loaded up 4 big bunkers of coal put on over a half a mile of foot-thick manila rope to tow this boat with, and off he went. He had a crew of 4 guys. The plan was to get the pumps running on the Kurataba, which was a big square-masted ship, to get the pump running and leave somebody on that boat running the pump so the pump could run, and they were going to tow it back to New York City, which sounds absolutely nuts. But so he went over there, and he went into this Cape 3 Points and inquired, and they said, oh yeah, the ship's anchored 12 miles down the coast, you know, and it's anchored there. It's been anchored for 2 years since it got here, never moved again. But it actually sunk. But it hadn't sunk completely out of sight because it was sitting on the bottom. So it just kind of sat on this bar. It was there. So him and his 4 crew and his little freighter went down and got as close as he could to it. And they went ashore in these dugout canoes that came out to him. They came out, and, you know, the people that lived there, the local people, they came out in their little canoes, and they picked him up, brought him to shore, and he told them what the story was, and that he was there to take the ship. And King Sam said, oh boy, thank God, because, you know, we took a big mortgage out on that to build our village here, and, you know, they're going to take it anyway. And he said, yeah, well, that's who sent me. You know, we're going to repossess the ship, and we're going to take it back to New York. And he said, well, good luck with that. And he gave him a dog while he was there. They treated him like a king, and they treated him really good. And they gave him a dog to bring home. And it was a real funny-looking dog because it didn't have any hair. He said it looked an awful lot like a pig. But it didn't make the whole journey home. But he writes about it in his story because he wrote the story of this boat and this trip. And because it was such a long hawser, over half a mile long, and it was Manila, it wasn't nylon like they have now, it was kind of like at the end of the time of Manila. Manila went out during World War II. It's the longest tow on the Manila hawser that ever happened. Not only in the distance of the hawser, but in the distance of the trip that one vessel towed another from Africa all the way back. And he didn't really, when he left Africa, he had a fellow, it took him a while to get this boat. It wouldn't run. It had 2 pumps. Only one could they get running. So they got one running. It took almost 2 weeks to pump the water out of the boat. It had leaked that much, and all the time it sat there. Of course, boats leak anyway. Once they got it up and started towing it, once they got to sea, they found they could make no headway. They had to lengthen it out as long as they could. One of the main reasons is they had the long tow rope. So if the boat should sink, they have enough time to cut the line before they go down too. Because it's not unusual for something under tow to sink and take the towing vessel down with it, especially at night. And even here, up off of Marian's Point in Plymouth, there are several barges and tugboats on the bottom where they'd come through the canal. They were headed north. During World War II, the barges would sink at night, and they'd take the tugs down with them. You know, if they were quick enough to chop the line, and it has to be really quick. I'm telling you, stuff happens on the water, it happens just like that. And actually there's a train. They had a train on the barge. A train. They were towing it to Boston. When the barge sank, within 2 minutes, the tugboat was gone. That quick. But it just come out of the canal, it was really close. So when the barge went down, tug went down. So they had a lot of line on there to protect themselves, basically. So they left, and they were going very slow. And it took them a long time. And they had to go a little bit south to get to the equator, to cross the Atlantic on the equator, because on the equator, the tide runs east to west, and that would get them over towards the Caribbean. So it picked up a little bit of speed, but not much. By the time they got to Barbados, you know, they were just really worn down. They went in there, and they hired 200 local people to dive and scrape the mussels and barnacles off the bottom of the boat. They were so thick that even when you sat on the deck, you could hear the mussels and the barnacles opening and closing. And it took them, like I said, 2 weeks, 200 people. The boat came up 10 inches. 10 inches it came up. And their speed increased significantly as they left Barbados, and they were bound for New York. And they were pretty happy. And of course, they probably had a lot of rum in Barbados. And they were getting weren't really paying that good of attention. And they caught their coal on fire. But they couldn't put the fire out because the gas was so toxic. They go down in the hole to try and put the fire out, and it was so toxic, so they just had to cut that hole right off and let it burn. They left a bunker plate open so the smoke could come out so that they could go down and work off the other bunkers. But from that point on, till they got to New York, they were on fire. And they couldn't put it out. And then, so they moved along, and they got into New York, and it took them about a year to refit that boat. And a year later, Alden was commissioned to sail that boat to Liverpool. And on the first trip to Liverpool with that vessel, he made back half the money it cost him to tow the boat back and refurbish it. And on the second trip, they were really in the black heavy duty. They were making money. And on the third trip, they sold it for $800,000. So, they came out of it really big. But it was a huge, huge gamble. But, this was a record for him. He kind of had a big ego anyway. Not that I don't. But he had a really big one. And now he had like the world's longest tow on this big hawser, and he was really proud of himself, and he should be. But the best thing was he was going to England, and he was going to Italy, he was going to France, and he had all these women that he was keeping in touch with. That's all going on in the background because he also has a wife who is now a school teacher and a couple of young kids. Like here in Pecasset. So he's doing pretty good. And that's the story of Alden. And I told you the story of, and that's pretty much Alden right there. He went to school, he grew up right here in town. In his grandfather's backyard, there was a deck cabin from a schooner built in 1850. We still have that deck cabin. It's in the pavilion at Uptuxet. It still exists. He played in that as a kid. As he grew older, his father, who was Edward Barlow, he sailed back and forth to South America because at that time, they had cut down most of the wood around here for trains and for houses. There weren't a lot of trees here. And they were bringing wood in from Georgia and South America. So in the summers, he was going back and forth all the time, every year. His mother would tutor him. And he learned to navigate. He learned to sail. He was an expert. And he got his master's license in his teens, just like eating potato chips. No problem at all. He was really, really a talented individual. But that was how he became that way. And then once he got down into New York, him and his brother both went to New York, his brother Julian. Julian grew up the same life. As soon as he got into New York, he was running the tugboat. And Julian's tugboat's logs are still around. They just surfaced within the last couple of years. They're all handwritten logs from back, 100 years ago. And they're very interesting. Julian kept track of everything he did every day. So, I told you the story of it was called the Curate Harbor. And did I send a picture around so that everybody could see it? This is what it looked like. You can just pass it around. That's the boat that he towed all the way from Africa back to New York City, which was the longest tow. So, again, he had been a seafarer in a seafaring family, so to speak. His father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, all the way back to the Revolutionary War, all the way back to George Barlow, actually, had been sea captains. George Barlow was a marshal in Bourne, of Sandwich at the time. He was really mean, really nasty. The whole family got moved way down the other end of town, away from all the good residents of Sandwich. And after that, all the men would go to sea. That's what they did. And that's how Alden ended up in the water, on the ocean. Okay, so Alden was born in 1887. Alden was born in 1887. Grandson of Jesse. He held master's licenses in sail at a very young age, then a master's license in steam. He amassed a lot of money, and they passed around the picture. He amassed a lot of fame, and he now had pretty much retired to Bourne, but as he got older, and he always ran freighters, he fell down a passageway in a freighter and broke his hip. And back then, they didn't pin your hip. They would try to, they give you a lot of medication. He had heroin, he had morphine, a lot of scotch to wash it down with, But still, he couldn't get rid of the pain. A lot of pain. And he got through life, and he still managed to get back to Europe and keep in touch with all his women. And he started writing them letters, and they would write him letters. And the letters would be sent to Pocasset or to New York City. And in Pocasset, they weren't sent to his house where my grandmother lived. They were sent to his sister's house. And she would keep them till he was in the neighborhood, because she knew what was going on. Nobody else knew what was going on, but she knew what was going on. Sisters usually do. And as they moved forward, Alden was his life was really good. And even though he fell down this passageway, he still captained ships for quite a while. And he was really good at it. And if he said he was going to be in a place, he was there. He might not leave on time, but he always managed to get where he was going when he was supposed to be there. I don't know how he did it. And he seemed to be welcome. People loved to see him everywhere. If he was going to France, or if he was going to Italy, if he was going to Spain, if he was going, he was really welcomed. Of course, nobody knew he had a family at home either. They never talked about that. So as time went on, he was kind of a skinflint too. He was really tight, and he developed a lot of the land that I showed you in the picture, and he sold those house lots. Did I cover that yet? Mm-hmm. Okay, so he sold those house lots. So he always had an income, and he broke his hip, and there's a Mariners hospital called Brighton Marine Hospital in Boston, and if you were really hurt bad and you were in the Merchant Marine, they would fix you up there. So he finally had to go to the hospital in the late 1930s. And he was in there for a couple of years. And they put him in a cast, and they kept him there until his hip all grew together, but he couldn't move his arm. His leg. He locked his leg, they locked his hip, and it grew that way, and they kept him in the hospital. And that was how he happened to write this story. This young nurse, Miss Perry, who he became very fond of, and spent a lot of time with him, convinced him that, because he would tell all the stories, that he should write this story down. And this, at that time, this publication that it was in still exists today, the Sea Watch. It's a Merchant Marine Mariners monthly, basically. Like Yankee Magazine is for us, this is their magazine, and it still exists today. They still publish it. But in 1941, he wrote this story for them at her, he was just so excited. He was going to be published. This guy was, as he's coming out of the hospital, he's like in seventh heaven. You know, he's just famous. This is cool. And there was a whole thing going on in the background that he wasn't aware of. You see, he had all his love letters hidden in his water department office. While he was in the hospital, his wife, Rose Landers, and his daughter, Priscilla, took over the water department office to run it, to keep money coming in. What else are you going to do? Do all the billing and collect all the money? And well, damned if they didn't stumble across these love letters. You know? And my grandfather had been a real skinflint. I mean, he really was. My Aunt Priscilla wanted to go to college, and he told her, you know, she was a very well-endowed young girl, that she could do fine as a wet nurse. And she was very insulted. And my grandmother was really angry because she wanted her daughter to go to college. My grandmother went to college. She wanted her to be a teacher. She had been a teacher. Why not? And Alden said, you know, it costs money. I don't want to part with no money. Alden was pretty cheap. So my grandmother got these letters, and first she was really angry. And then after a time, she thought, I'm telling this secondhand because this is, my Aunt Priscilla told me the story in 2002. 2002, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but at that time, my grandmother and my aunt found these letters. And my aunt said, what are you going to do? And my grandmother said, number one, don't you ever tell anybody, ever. Don't you ever tell anybody. So, okay. So when my grandfather came home, he was having a difficult time because he couldn't go up and down stairs in the house, or even go up the stairs into the house. And he mentioned to my grandmother that this was a problem. She said, well, it's really not a problem, Alden, because you're going to go down and live in your water department office. He said, well, what are you talking about? I said, yeah, well, come across these letters. And I've been corresponding with these women, and that's what she was doing. And here's the deal, you know, I am going to expose you for the really bad person that you are, or you are going to do what I want you to do. And he said, oh, he had to think about it a little bit. And he said, all right, what is it you want to do? So I want my own home. I'm going to build my own home. He said, well, where are you going to build it? I got all kinds of land. I said, I don't want your land. I'm going to buy my own land over in Buzzards Bay. My son lives in Buzzards Bay. I don't want to live there. He said, well, if that's what you want to do. And they had this big, beautiful house that he built for her on Wayne's Neck Road. And it's still there. And the house is still there even then. They're not selling the house. The house sat there vacant. She moved to Buzzards Bay. Had her own brand new little house built right where Quintal's was in Buzzards Bay. And he had to live in his little water department office. And there are people, I mean, he lived a different life. You know, you would think that an old man living all by himself now, he wasn't really old, he was in his 40s and 50s and 60s, that he would be an unhappy person. But he wasn't. He had lots of morphine and lots of heroin and lots of scotch and cigars and plenty of money coming in because he owned the water department office. He couldn't go see these women anymore because he was an old man, but he had pictures, you know, visions, whatever you want to call it. I actually thought his house was wallpapered with pictures of, now, I wasn't allowed to go in his house until I was 13. You know, I would go down there with my father, and I was never allowed to go in this house. He had chickens out back. I could go out, feed the chickens, get some eggs, play with the chickens. Had a dog, I could play with the dog. Never allowed in that house. But when I was 13, you know, I could hitchhike down to Pecasset and go visit my grandfather. All of a sudden, I was allowed to. I'll never forget it, the first time I went in that house. It was a bottle of scotch. He's sitting at like a desk. in this little office, and he had a nice wooden chair and a nice desk. And there was pills all over the desk, and there was a bottle of scotch and a glass, and he was dressed in his captain's uniform, always dressed in his captain's uniform, always had his cover right there, his hat. And everywhere they were. I thought there were pictures of naked women. But a woman in the Historic Society recently pointed out to me that those were calendars. I never saw a date. But they did. They had little tiny calendars on the bottom. They were all calendars. And they were pin-up calendars. And wow, and I missed that. How, I don't know how. And I used to think, wow, if he ever dies, I wonder if I'm going to inherit those. Yeah, this guy owed, all kinds of land, and he had all kinds of, and he did have a lot of money when he passed away even. But, I was only interested in those calendars. I'm a product of him. What the hell? Yeah, and so that wasn't the end of the story. My aunt never told anybody. My father at the time, this was in the late 1940s, he had 7 children, and him and my mother were still renting. So my grandmother called up my grandfather and said, Alden. Alden said, yes, what do you want? Scared to death. Said, Galon can't find a house to rent anymore. He's got 7 children, all little kids, and getting tough. Why don't you take Rita out and find them a nice house? He said, what do you mean? I said, you don't have to buy it. Just come up with a down payment. Get him in a house. And sure enough, he called my mother up, and my mother told me this. She never knew why either. But he comes over one day in his car, and his hip's locked, so you got to understand, he's driving this 1950 Chevrolet, so it was in 1950, probably a 49 Chevy, but it was the first early automatic transmissions. And he hadn't been able to drive for years because they didn't have automatic transmissions. But when they came out with one, with his cane, he could run the gas and the brake. And that was how he drove. And he went and got her, and they went house hunting, so to speak. It didn't take long. They found a house that my mother thought was suitable and brought it to showed it to my father, and they hemmed and hawed, and nobody really wanted to do business with my grandfather because, man, he was tough. And my grandfather assured him, I'm going to give you the money, the down payment money. It was only $200. The house was a $2,000 house, but back then you could buy a decent house for that kind of money. So they bought it and they got the house. And my father never knew why his father had done that. He never knew. My father, in his whole life, never knew about the letters, never knew about the arrangement, never knew. And my grandmother, because my grandmother raised me from the time I was a child, every day she would call my grandfather. He lived in Pocasset. She lived in Buzzards Bay. And she'd say, Alden, I need mince pie mix, and I want pork chops tonight. and she might want some rice or some potatoes. Whatever it was she wanted, she'd make a little list and she'd tell him. And I want it by noon. And he would come driving in the yard at 11:30 with his cane, with his car. He was really a tough driver. And but he would bring her stuff. He couldn't get out of his car. She had her house built on a hill, so he couldn't get up to it. She would have to walk down and get the stuff. He could not get up to her front door. He never got into her own house. And, she would go down and she would get her stuff, and she would thank him. She would never give him any money. and he would go on his way. And every Sunday, my grandfather, Alden, we all had to call him Captain Barlow. If we'd have called him Alden, he'd beat us with his cane. We all had to call him Captain. He would come to the house. He would usually pick up my sister Judy, but if she wasn't available, one time she broke her arm, she was out of commission for a while, he would take me. And we would go to Onset, because on Sunday, he would go to Onset to buy us kids candy. He would buy us candy, and then he'd buy Tootsie Roll Pops for all the kids in the neighborhood down there. And all the kids, they all remembered what a nice guy he was, and that he was always giving them lollipops. You know, but what he was really doing was we'd get to onset, and he'd give us 50 cents. Say, go over to Kenny's taffy stand there and get some taffy and some candy. Don't come back for a couple hours. Take your time. You can walk on the beach. And when you get back to the car, he'd always be talking to some woman. You know, he'd go over there and he'd park on the pier. He couldn't get out of his car and walk. Look at all the girls on the beach. You know, all of them. Get a pair of field glasses and everything. Make sure he could pick one out if he knew her. And sure enough, by the time you get back to the car, there'd be some woman talking to him, and he'd be engaged in a lively conversation. And, you know, and then you'd go on your way, you'd go home, and he'd go back to Pocasset. But he was always wanting to interact with women. And I can't say that I'm not guilty of that. But, you know, he took it another step, that's all. You know, and as time went on, nobody knew where these letters were. These letters had never been spoken of yet. You know, none of us knew why my grandfather kowtowed to her so bad. I mean, he did. I don't care what it was. He did. And I can remember when he died in 1964. And at that time, my grandmother she had a lot of arthritis problems. And I'd have to, if we go to church, she couldn't pick her feet up in the front seat of the car. I'd have to pick her feet up and put them in the car. She could walk to the car, but she couldn't pick her feet up to get them in the car. So when we were walking, and this is in the cemetery down in Pocasset, I was holding her arm. And I think my brother Tommy was on the other side holding her other arm. And we walked her to the burial site. You know, the grave was open and everybody was there, and lowering my grandfather into the ground. And now, you know, this is my grandfather and my grandmother, who all of us thought really kind of loved each other. We don't know. And she's holding, and she goes, "Rot in hell, Alden." Wow. You know, I'm going, you know, my grandmother went to church every Sunday. And she goes, he actually said, "I hope you rot in hell, Alden." I'm going, wow, she didn't call him Captain. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I was just shocked. And I had absolutely no idea why. Neither did my brother Tom. Neither did my mother. We're all going, ooh. You know, and then we kind of all got over it, you know, and my grandmother, you know, everybody took care of my grandmother. She died. She lived another 4 years. Everything was good. No more speaking of that. She never really talked much about Alden after that. But oddly enough, when she died, she'd stipulated that she didn't want to be buried next to him. She wanted an empty grave spot between her and him. So she's buried in the same big lot. But she's actually buried, you know, she's not buried next to him. She don't care who's buried next to him. It ain't going to be her. And that's the way she was buried, at her own request. So in the early 1990s, that house that they had originally built on Wings Neck Road, where my grandmother and my Aunt Priscilla had, you know, they found the love letters in the office. In order to get them where my grandfather couldn't get them, and they knew he couldn't climb stairs, they put them in the eaves of the house on the second floor, in the attic. They put all these letters in there. Some letters he had written to women that had come back, and then some letters that had been written to him. And a person found him, and my brother Tom was a selectman at the time. And the person knew who he was, and they brought the letters to him, and they said to Tommy, "You should see these letters. These are letters from your father to women." And Tommy said, "What are you talking about, my father?" "Oh, yeah, your father, Captain Barlow. These..." He said, "Let me take those letters from my mother. I'd like to see what's going on." My mother saw the letters. They're both sitting there on the kitchen table now, reading all these letters to all these women and all this. And my mother said, "You know, your father could never know this. You know, there may be other Barlows out there somewhere. Your father could never know this." Tommy said, "What do you want me to do?" "Take him back. Tell him to put him in the eaves. Leave him there." And Tommy did. That's what Tommy did. Tommy does what he's told, just like all of us do, because we're scared the hell of the women. No, it's not true. But yeah, he did it. He brought them back and he returned people that owned the house. And at that time, I was kind of getting involved in history a little bit. And my mother told me a couple of years later about these letters and the story that my grandfather had been a scallywag. Big surprise. You know, I'd been in this guy's house. He was a scallywag. Yeah. So I had, it was not a surprise to me for some reason. And I said, whoa, I'd like to read the letters. So this is probably 92, 93. Tommy first went down and said, oh, the house has been sold. So, okay, well, we'll talk to the next people. And talk to the next people. Said, don't know what you're talking about. There's no letters here. And it was kind of the end of it. No more letters. These love letters are lost forever. Then in the around 2000, I opened a clam shack down in Bourne, and I had one of my grandsons, David, working for me. David had some real bad tooth issues. His father took him down to a dentist on Barlow's Landing Road. So while he's in there, the dentist says to him, hey, I got some of your granddaddy's letters. And David said, what are you talking about? David's my grandson. He said, oh, he said, yeah, these letters from way back in 1920. He said, oh, no. My grandfather wasn't alive then. It wasn't him. I said, well, tell him about it. So he did. He comes down and he tells me. My mom's a dentist. I got a daughter that's a dental hygienist who knows a lot of dentists. And I said, hey, Nanette, get a hold of this woman and see what's going on with these letters. Well, as it turned out, when I got a hold of her, I went down there, finally went down to their office, and she had sold them. They were gone. And I wrote her a very nice letter explaining to her what I knew of the story at that time, and I didn't know the whole story. I only knew that these letters existed. I didn't really know much about them. Well, damned if she didn't get the letters back for me. And she called and said, I've got them back. Come pick them up. So I did. But I still didn't really know what I had. It's only like 2000, 2001. So in 2002, like I said, I own this little clam shack down in Bourne, Clam Hell. All my family comes and eats there. Well, my father's sister used to come in a couple times a year. And she came in one day, and my brother Tommy happened to be there also. Tommy and I are sitting there talking with her. She was about 90 at the time. I said to her, Aunt Priscilla, do you ever know anything about your father having love letters? And oh, wow. It's like I turned on a light. She didn't stop talking for an hour. She hated her father, hated him. She told me all the stories of how he insulted her through her life, and then how they found those letters, and my grandmother pinned them to the ground. And she said, from that point on, I don't know why. Whatever her mother said, he did. But he was scared to death because she had figured out that his ego was more important to him than anything.
Did Priscilla go to school?
Priscilla ended up being a principal in Dartmouth. Okay. Yeah, she did. She went to college. Yeah, Priscilla did go to school. Priscilla got her way. My grandmother, that was the first thing, was that Priscilla went to college. Priscilla, eventually she got married. Her son became a captain. He went to Mass Maritime and he became a captain. Yet his grandfather was so angry, and we never knew why he was so angry with Priscilla. He never had anything to do with her or her kids. Again, even when we were growing up, he had nothing to do with it. He had disowned her. And it was an awful shame for him to miss her family. But she was tough too. She really didn't care. She didn't really care that he didn't want to have anything to do with her family. And she was very proud of being a Barlow. And but he had never had anything to do with her. He kind of disowned her. But when he died, my grandmother and my father made sure that she got the part of the estate that she was entitled to, and she was very happy with it. She didn't care if she got anything, but they made sure they almost had to force it on her to take it because she had made her own life. She was very happy. Very strong women in that family, very strong. And the men were, even historically, my great-grandfather was really good. His father was really good. But when you get back to the Revolutionary period, every once in a while you come across one that's a real character. You know, he might have a wife and a family in Nantucket, but he's got in Pecasset, but he's got a woman on Nantucket. You know, it just, the same thing. It just, you know, so that's pretty much it. So Rose ended up having a really good life, and she really leveraged it with those letters. And there are people in Pecasset still, even to this day, that still remember Captain Barlow. And he demanded respect. He was always a captain, always. And, you know, he didn't talk much about his family. He never told anybody he had a wife, you know, and she didn't give a damn. So I guess I'm going to wrap it up.
You want to show the picture?
Oh, yeah, and this is pictures of, this was, I'll send this around. The oldest fellow, the tallest fellow was Edward Barlow. He was a really well-respected, and I've told stories about him. He was a sea captain, good family man. This is his son, the scallywag. This is my grandfather, and every once in a while you get one. He was a good man. He never beat his children or nothing, to the best of my knowledge. But, or any other woman's children. Yeah, and then this, of course, is my father, Galon, and that's my brother, Eddie. He was the oldest. He died in the Korean War. So Galon looks a lot like my brother Tommy, you know, except that picture was taken like in 1935. So, but this was the guy that's the captain with the cane, and I'm telling you, I don't know. I want to point out that, you know, we don't usually tell everybody this, but Haley is kin to me. She's one of my granddaughters. You know, and I have a lot of them. I got.
This is Tommy? No, this is your other.
My brother Eddie. So Eddie would have been the oldest. If Eddie was alive today, he'd be like 82, 83.